we'll walk through these 8 steps, and then we'll come to another issue that is particularly important around sewer and septic. All right. So the first step for local advocates, and this is both in terms important to contextualize it for any individual, but also important later for messaging, which we'll come to, is to understand the scope of the housing crisis. We have seen a rents increase by 20% since 2021. We've seen the median a home sale price increase by 36% since 2020. There are a whole raft of stats that show how critical the need is for more affordable housing right now. So I think that's the first step along the way, is to really understand the depth of the crisis. Step two is to understand what you can do locally in terms of the documents that are already produced by your town. So when I start thinking about what to do in any given town, I want to roll up my sleeves and dig into what the town has already been doing on planning and zoning. So step one is looking at the zoning ordinance. There's also the plan of conservation and development, which is a plan that has to be put out every 10 years by the town, that looks at both how it is planning to grow and how it's planning to conserve land. Um, it's an important document. In the history of Connecticut, those documents have generally leaned towards the conservation side, and folks who are interested in ensuring that we have affordability have not gotten so engaged in shaping plans for municipalities. So it's a great place to enter into advocacy on the issue. It's also a great way to see what the town is already planning on doing, and think about how any advocacy you might do could match up with plans the town already has. So the more we can sort of bring those two things together, the better. Uh, Several years ago, I think 2017, Connecticut passed a law where all municipalities had to create affordable housing plans. We'll talk a little bit more about those later, but that's another thing to look at, to think about how you can either impact that or align your advocacy efforts with what's already going on in your town. And then another document, which I never would have thought to even take the time to look at before doing this work, is the Water Policy Control Authority regulations. And it's important because it tells you what is going on in your municipality with sewer and septic issues. And we'll come to that when Hugh talks about our second report. When looking at these documents, we have a whole series of questions you might think about asking about the scale of development that is permitted with the in different parts of town, looking at the number of units, looking at the density. I'm not going to go through all of those, but they're outlined in the guide, and they're sort of the tip of the iceberg for things to look at, but it's a way to get started looking at these documents. Also, consider what's attainable in your town given the local political situation, but also push for a meaningful goal. What we've seen happen in Connecticut is we have this law 8-30G that really has folks focused on growing by 2% or maybe 10%. And for some towns, that percentage, towns especially that actually haven't made a lot of progress on affordable housing, those percentages are below, especially the 2%, what the town really should be doing if it's trying to play its full role in its region and generating affordable housing. So we recommend that municipalities or advocates of municipalities think about starting with numbers that have recently come out from the state through what's called the Fair Share Study, commissioned by the Office of Policy and Management. And think about those numbers perhaps in over a 20-year period, so maybe a quarter of the number for your municipality over each 5-year period of that 20-year um, period overall. And think about having real goals. I think, as many of us know, if you don't have a goal, it's hard to get something accomplished. And having a goal that is part of an overall effort by the state to meet uh, people in the state to meet the need for affordable housing is a great way to be part of the solution. Um, learn all the different strategies. We touch on in this report lots of different things, lots of different approaches that municipalities can take to getting to the numbers they want to reach. And there's so many different kinds, everything from missing middle, which is something in between a single family home and a large skyscraper multi-family housing development, to pocket communities, which are really great ways to have all kinds of mixed income housing centered around usually like a central courtyard, that are, I think, really effective in many parts of Connecticut. Think about how housing subsidies could play a role in making the project you're envisioning happen. The Partnership for Strong Communities has a great sort of app on their website that helps provide information about all the different programs that are out there. So definitely encourage you to check that out. Inclusionary zoning is something else to consider. That's zoning in town where, in sort of in exchange for higher density, there's the developers are then agreeing to have a certain percentage of the housing be affordable, usually deed restricted affordable for a certain amount of time. Inclusionary zoning has to be done very carefully because there's a way to do inclusionary zoning where the percentage of units that are affordable is too high, or the depth of affordability is too low, and it means that no developer will come along and want to do it. And so it has to be really carefully calibrated so that it's actually ensures that developers will be interested in doing it, and that just takes some doing. And we're happy to talk with folks about that. And really talking to your local developers is a great way to peg it down. So those are just a couple ideas. They're more in the report. Step 5 is to pick a spot or pick a policy to change. So look around town, see where you might see a vacant lot or a lot that's really in being underutilized for whatever reason. Look at areas along Main Street. Look at places maybe near a school or other transportation options, other sort of amenities like that. And then it's important to start to scope out developers, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Alternatively, you could think about actually changing a policy in town. So that may be allowing buildings that are a little higher on Main Street, or it may be allowing duplexes or triplexes in a regular single family home residential neighborhood. There are lots of options, and something like that is zone wide is a great way to just unleash the power of zoning to help create some affordability in your town. Know your neighbors, your elected officials, and developers. So it's really important as you sort of go through your day in your community, and I'm seeing so many people on this call who have done this, to start to forge these connections and shared understanding with people whether it's at wherever if you go to church or synagogue, or if you are part of any kind of community group. When you start to have those conversations about the need for affordable housing, you can start to gather groups of people who care about this. And it is maybe later during the Q&A, some of the folks who've been so successful at doing that can chime in and talk about things that have worked for them. Then what I recommend is once you have sort of a core group together, you can start reaching out to local elected officials and engage them, get them on board, share your concern about the issue, your interest in the issue. And then the next step is to engage those developers. And the way I think of doing this, and this is what I've actually done, is I've driven around. If I see a building that I think really works well, looks beautiful, I find out who developed it and track that developer down. Another option is to go to there's the Connecticut Home Builders, which is an organization that has a whole network of developers who are available to do, in some cases, mixed income development. If you know any land use attorneys, they might have recommendations. If you know any zoning attorneys, sorry, any planners, and we have a planner joining us in a few minutes. They might have some ideas for you too. Consider your messaging. We think of messaging as looking first at the interests that might be interests you can appeal to in your town. So think about diversity and equity. For some people, that's something that is a little bit that creates a little bit of trepidation, but we have found that lots of people we talk to, that's a huge concern. And that brings them to this. They know that if you're in a suburban, mostly white, high resource community, residents know that their kids are going to schools that do not reflect the diversity of the workplace they're going to be in the future. They know that there's benefits to all kinds of different perspectives in school. And so that can really be appealing. Also, we know that there are seniors looking to downsize. We know that there are people who have kids coming home from college who would love to live in the town if they could. There are lots of interests like that that are worth appealing to. And then you can sort of develop your whole crew of stakeholders based on some of those interests. So bring in those recent college graduates, those seniors, the teachers. Municipal employees can often be really, really helpful advocates for more affordable housing in the town. And when they can, their personal stories are a fantastic way to mobilize more people. And I've been at meetings where you have a whole room full of mostly seniors, and this is in municipalities where the senior population is growing, the younger population, families with kids, is dwindling, the schools are declining in enrollment. And in these forums, there are very few young people. And so you get a few young people standing up saying, I grew up here, I would love to stay here, but I can't. And that starts to really resonate with the rest of the crowd. Myth busting is also important. We know from years of looking at this that mixed income housing with some affordable units does not increase taxes, increase crime, decrease property values. The research on this is really definitive. So bringing that in and helping people understand that this is going to be fine. In fact, it's going to be better than fine. It's going to improve the community is really important. Also showing pictures of housing that is beautiful. And there's so much beautiful mixed income and affordable housing out there. It's not hard to do. And there are also ways for municipalities to bring certain architectural requirements into what they are allowing when it comes to mixed income housing, and helping municipalities understand that has been really helpful as well. Understand the law. We have a section in this report that goes through some of the relevant laws, but we also have and reference a whole other report that we've done that gets deep into the relevant laws. But maybe one of the most important is the Zoning Enabling Act, which is the way in which the state of Connecticut has delegated the power to zone from the state to municipalities, but not with carte blanche. They have included all kinds of requirements around, among other things, providing for affordable housing, multifamily housing, housing for people at a range of incomes. And so that's already an obligation that municipalities have, and emphasizing that is one way to sort of move the process along. Some of these other things we've talked about already. One of the ones here at the end here is the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, for which there is a summary in the report, and I won't go into the details, but I think folks know generally that's the law in Connecticut, longstanding, over 35 years old, where developers get a leg up in court when they propose affordable housing in municipalities that have a low level. It is a way to get more housing built. So those are our steps. We've just run through them. We hope they'll be helpful to folks. And we're happy to get more feedback from everybody, and hope we welcome any kind of input. We'd also love to present these to a group. If you're with a group in your community, and it would be helpful to get a little sense of how to get going on this stuff, we'd love to be involved. So with that, I will turn it over to Hugh Bailey, who will talk to us about a report that did not get named the name that I had in mind. So it's called Pipeline to Prosperity. The name I was thinking of was The Scoop on Poop, but that's okay. I understand, and turn it over to Hugh.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate that. And thank you for acceding to my requests on the name. That means a lot to me. I want to talk about this issue in particular, just because it's something that is such a serious issue for people who are developing affordable housing. There are so many issues that come up. There are so many potential roadblocks. But we found that time and again, sewer, septic, wastewater, it's not, a topic you might choose if you don't know much about, housing in general or planning, but it is something that comes up all the time. And we find it comes up in both good faith arguments and in the sort of NIMBY arguments. And so we wanted to sort of tackle some of the ins and outs of this. So just some basics, this is infrastructure. It's just like any other infrastructure, roads, wires, anything else. You have to have the pipes if you're going to do any kind of development, housing or otherwise. Sewers and septic systems are both effective at what they do. They both work. They both use similar technology. They're on different scales. They are expensive, and that's something we'll talk about. Getting the funding to get specifically sewer lines can be a challenge, and that's something that can be a real obstacle, especially for smaller scale developments. In terms of the environment, they're both environmentally responsible, especially if you have a septic system. There's not a lot of moving parts. You can have it pumped out every 2 years, and easily the system can last for decades. So both of them can be considered to be environmentally responsible. When you're talking about really dense development, you need a sewer hookup. There's just no question that when you get into, urban areas, when you're looking at a city, a large apartment building, big office, that kind of thing, you absolutely need a sewer hookup. But this idea that septic can only be useful for single family homes is something that we should really try and get past, because septic can do more than that. You can hook up more than just single family homes in the suburbs. It doesn't just have to be rural areas that have septic. You can do a lot more than what we currently do. And there's also this in between called community septic, where you can serve a large number of units, up into the hundreds without a sewer hookup. It is a septic system. It all happens on site. It is a very expensive option, but it is something that's available if you want to do something that is on the large side, but a connection to a sewer is just not an option. So those are just the basics. This is a map that is available on the DEEP website that shows where all the sewer lines are in the state of Connecticut. And you can see it's basically a population map, where the highest populations are, the 95 corridor, the 91 corridor, Farmington Valley. There are a lot of sewer lines available, but also in the parts that we don't necessarily associate with the higher populations. Even in the less populated areas, there are a lot of sewer lines available. So it just shows that there is a lot to build on. There is a lot that we can do with this map. Even in places that, up in Litchfield County, there are some smaller scale sewer systems that can be extended, that can be tapped into in a lot of the downtowns. A lot of the more rural areas, even the lower population areas, do have sewer systems. So that's something to keep in mind. One of the big issues, obviously, is space. If you have a septic system, it is going to take up a lot more acreage than a sewer system, because the wastewater treatment happens on site. The water is released right back into the environment right there on site. So you do need more space. However, septic systems do not require nearly as much space as towns often provide for them. Most of the research shows that you can do single family homes on septic. You do not need anything like the 2-acre minimum that we have in a lot of Connecticut. You can really do it on down to about a half acre or less in some cases. And that's important because, the biggest driver of cost, the biggest driver of the lack of affordability is the land. The land itself is so expensive. And if you say that you can only build a single family home on a 2 acre lot, that automatically makes it so much more expensive than it has to be. So if you can utilize smaller lots, if you can, get away from that 2 acre zoning, or in some cases in Fairfield County, there's 4 acre zoning. If you can get away from that, you're not going to harm anything in terms of the public health code. There is nothing health wise that prevents you from using a smaller lot size for a septic system. There's also the question of water supply. There's water and sewer. Water and sewer often go together. Wells require extra space. They have to be a certain distance away from a septic system. They don't always go together. There is plenty of Connecticut that has public water, but not public sewers. They have public water and a septic system. So, you have to kind of mix and match how these go. But even in a case where you have a well and a septic system, 2 acre lots are not necessary in most cases, and certainly not a 2 acre minimum for a town. That is just way more than is necessary. Certainly expense is a big issue. Sewer expansions, if you see them reported in the news, you can see that they run into the millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. A pumping station can, be a major expense that is probably going to be something that's paid off with bonding over many, many years. So it's something that, you certainly need to plan for. In terms of funding, the state's Clean Water Fund is the main current source for sewer funding in Connecticut. But crucially, you have to be abating groundwater pollution rather than promoting development. And that's key because it has an environmental ring to it rather than a development. And, the state has a lot of goals, including about, promoting affordability and promoting affordable housing. And it sort of runs into, some contradictions because the main source of sewer funding, you really have to be abating pollution rather than promoting development. It doesn't mean there aren't other sources that you can use to fund sewers for promoting development. There are some state-focused grants, STEEP grants, small town economic assistance grants can be used. But if you're talking about expanding the sewer service area and it's a clean water fund, you're going to need deep approval. It becomes a long process, and it becomes something that has to go through a lot of hoops. Rightfully so. I mean, it's a complicated topic. There's a lot that has to be okayed, but you can't expect to be in for the long haul on these. So I think it's important, as I said before, wastewater is important, no matter what. And you do see it used sometimes as one of those NIMBY arguments of like, well, we just don't want it, so we'll come up with a reason why we can't do this. And sewer will come up in, that list of reasons. I'll say, well, the traffic and the school children and, all these other things that come up. It's not really that simple, though, because it really is something that has to be dealt with. And it's not something that you can, you can't wish away the expense, unfortunately. It's something that is going to be something that you have to deal with. And we're going to talk about a case study in a few minutes where the wastewater was the real issue that got in the way of the development, and it's something they were able to overcome, which is great. But another takeaway is that, smaller scale multifamily development, you can do it on septic. There's a lot that you can do on septic beyond single family homes. And the limitation is rarely capacity, it's zoning, right? We have these zoning rules that, really sort of arbitrarily decide how big a lot has to be. It's very rarely about the wastewater capacity. And we should talk quickly about sewer avoidance. Sewer avoidance is, in layman's terms, it's something that towns do in order to avoid development. They have a policy that says, well, we don't want to have sewers because we don't want to have the development that goes along with it. That's something that is recognized by the state of Connecticut in 1977. As you can see here, they released a report declaring sewer avoidance a desirable policy in rural communities. And this link here to this Yale Law and Policy Review article from a few years back, really puts it succinctly that the presence or absence of public sewers is one of, if not the single most important factor shaping patterns of urban growth. There is a lot that can be done off of sewers, but if you have sewers, there is just so much more that is possible. There is so much more flexibility in terms of affordable housing development. And so whether those sewers are available and whether they're able to be expanded and whether you can get access to them is so important in terms of planning our affordable housing future. So we want to make this proactive. There are a lot of steps that advocates can take. You can learn whether your town has sewers and what the zoning is in the sewer accessible parts of town. I live in a more rural town, and I was a little surprised to find that there are sewers in my town. Not even far away from me, there's a manufacturing area that has sewers built in. Those are the kind of things that can be tapped into for residential development. The municipal plan of conservation and development, the affordable housing plan, every town has to have one, the Water Pollution Control Authority, all of these public documents and publicly accessible information have things that can be helpful. And the local director of health or sanitarian, that they have information that can, help guide you in terms of what is necessary and what you can do in terms of, leading the way on development. And you can advocate for greater density. You can, say that we can do more in terms of, allowing affordable housing, especially in areas that have sewers. You look at the map that I put up before. A lot of the Fairfield County towns where the demand is highest, some of those towns have sewers already in their residential areas. And if you have a sewer line and you only have single family homes on it, it's really being underutilized. There's really more capacity that could go in there. And so we really need to make sure that we're not using, a perceived lack of capacity as a reason not to do development, because there really is more that we can do. And you can dig into more resources on sewer and septic. We are happy to talk more about this. The report itself goes into a lot more detail, certainly than we can cover here. We just wanted to give a brief overview of where things stand. But I think that the key takeaway is that there's a lot more that we can do with existing infrastructure. Infrastructure is not an easy topic, but there is so much that is available, and there are a lot of resources out there. So with that, I would like to stop my share, and I will pass it back to Jen, who will lead us to our next section.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Welcome, John and Rob, to the panel. And we're just going to jump right in. We've got about 25 minutes and we've got a lot of information to cover. So why don't I start with Rob? Actually, why don't I have you all introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about what brings you here today? Anybody can start.
Sure. I'm Rob Mangiafico. I'm the president of the Commons Community Development Corporation. I didn't have a background in affordable housing, so when I heard that we were forming a CDC, I thought it might have something to do with the Center for Disease Control, but I've learned a lot quickly. We're looking to bring affordable housing into rural towns in Eastern Connecticut, and we've started with Hebron.
And, I'm John Guskowski. I'm a planner with Tyche Planning and Policy Group. A lot of my work is in rural communities, and a lot of that is in Eastern Connecticut. So I've been a town planner in probably a dozen communities on a staff or consulting basis. And I'm also the co-chair of the legislative committee for the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association, Connecticut's Planners. And we have advocated for many, many years at the Capitol about pushing forward on zoning reforms to encourage communities, or in fact require communities to be more active, be more proactive about making zoning rules and infrastructure available to increase housing opportunities in our communities.
That's great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Rob. And hi, Hugh. So, Rob, let's start with you. What was the general reception to your project from the town and from residents? What were you hearing the most when this project was proposed originally?
Sure. So we were looking to, we proposed around a 50-unit affordable housing, mixed income affordable housing here in Hebron, a rural community, about 9,000 people. And when we first spoke with the town really wanted to know if we could make it really small. They said, maybe we could start with like 4 and see how that goes. And so in discussion with them and talking about, economies of scale and how these things can work and how do you make it so that it can be sustainable for, decades after it's built, we were able to convince the town that something around 50 units would work on a 3-acre property. But it took a lot of discussion, honest discussion and engaging the town early on to be able to do this and to get the town to buy in on it. And working with their affordability plan as well. Hebron really doesn't have any affordable housing. Really, the rental market is almost zero. So, you know, it was a good partnership between the town and our organization to do this. You know, as far as the residents go, one of the key things we did early on was to have community conversations. And we partnered with an organization, the Coalition on Diversity and Equity, and we had a number of community conversations talking about what is affordable housing, dispelling some of those myths that Aaron Boggs had mentioned, talking about inviting questions, and then also inviting the community to give us feedback and to be a part of this, to talk about what kind of designs do you think you'd like? You know, what are some of the things that would help integrate this into a rural town such as Hebron? So in doing that, we were really kind of able to get ahead of some of those other, you know, issues, the NIMBY issues, the not in my backyard issues that other towns might be experiencing. So fortunately, it's been a very positive reception from the town of Hebron for what we've been proposing to do.
I think that's great. I think you know, sometimes we might go into these projects and we forget to engage the community, and so that hearing that made such a difference for you all, I think makes a lot of sense. Rob, I'm gonna throw one more question at you before I move on. I had the pleasure of being able to hear you tell us a bit about your story prior to the event, and one of the major challenges to building larger developments that will in fact need sewer hookups is money. These projects, I think, can be costly, and cost can be a major barrier to developers in towns. So what were some resources that you were able to tap into to keep the project moving forward?
Sure, yeah. So for us, we were lucky that there is sewer in Hebron, although we're kind of on the edge of the map, so it took some creativity to make that work. There is no public water that came down the street where we're doing this. And even if we were to extend the water line, there just wasn't enough water capacity in our town to support this. So we've had to be creative to go out and look for grants, loans, and funding to do this. So for the water side, we applied for a grant called the DECD grant through the state of Connecticut, and got a grant to find water sources. So we're in the process right now of doing test wells and developing kind of a community water source, not only for our project, but to help the town as well, because the town is really short on public water. So we're hoping to kind of support the town and our project at the same time. You know, key on that as well is having someone on your team that understands the grant writing process and going out and finding those grants, whether it's the Hartford Foundation or the Housing Ministries of New England. We've been really just working hard to get those grants, and then working with your local representatives and your state representatives as well, to see what they can do. So we were lucky to engage with our local congressperson and get a large grant that's going to help us kind of hit the ground running. And when you talk about these costs, we haven't broke ground yet. We're hoping to do that next year, but the costs for pre-development can easily exceed $1 million. So you really have to think about funding from day one. Grants, loans. We're working with the Department of Housing to we're able to get a pre-development loan grant from the Department of Housing of Connecticut. And then also a few other loans that we got through other organizations to help us kind of kickstart things. And then the last thing is again, potentially partnering with a development agency or a development partner that does this professionally, that does a number of developments, is they can bring some more resources to the table as well. So put all that together and we're 70% maybe of where we need to be. So even though we've got all this funding lined up, it's a never ending process of getting more and more funding to make sure you can see this process through to the end successfully.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. I think as residents are thinking about taking on some of these projects, not as, you know, members of an organization, we're not thinking about things like bringing on a grant writer to the project. So thank you for highlighting that. John, I think this is for you. In addition to the efforts in Hebron, where else in the state do you see some movement on affordable housing, and what strategies are advocates using that you're seeing that are working?
So I would highlight just a couple. There's lots of little tiny efforts going on all over the place. I am seeing in the Naugatuck Valley the all-in groups that are being founded that really try to empower local advocates, local champions, and give them the tools. Those communities, the all-in communities, are doing fantastic advocacy. I would say a little bit closer to home, actually quite close to Hebron. Some of the efforts in Hebron are spilling over to some of the neighboring communities in Andover and Columbia, both two towns I am involved with. In Columbia, I would say the efforts of Hebron and the group called CODE, the Council on Diversity and Equity, was actually very influential in advocating with the Columbia Planning and Zoning Commission, where we just passed about maybe 6 months ago a zoning regulation for multifamily housing that, and I would note, Columbia has no public sewer infrastructure at all anywhere, and actually no public water infrastructure at all anywhere. Also, it's a very rural community. But they just passed, the zoning commission just passed multifamily regulations that basically have unlimited density. That's based entirely on your wastewater capacity. So if you can find some good soils, you can have as many units as you want. With the trick being 20% of those have to be affordable. If you do not include affordable housing in your multifamily development, you are reduced. You basically get 70% of your full build out capacity. Mm-hmm. So developers would be incentivized to find a place with some good soils and basically build the heck out of it. And Columbia Planning and Zoning is now basically saying, do it. Come one, come all. Let's encourage density and let's encourage affordable housing. So that's Columbia. The little town of Deep River along the Connecticut River is sort of belatedly coming around to the fact that they do have sewer lines and they have this great little downtown, and they want to grow. And they are realizing that relaxing their zoning regulations around housing and taking advantage of the fact that they do have this little area of sewer service, and they're overhauling their zoning regulations to try to encourage more development. And in the case of an old river community like Deep River, it's about redevelopment. Also, there's some factory buildings there. There's an old school that might be consolidated with a couple of other regional schools that could host a lot of housing capacity. So there's a couple of towns that are starting to come around to the fact that they need to not only grow but survive, because they're aging and they're not building the places where seniors want to retire to or downsize to, or young families want to move into, or first-time home buyers. So towns are starting to come around on it. It's not all NIMBY towns.
Yeah, and that is such an important point, because I think sometimes when we're out in the field and we're hearing so much pushback on the need for affordable housing in some of these communities, we're not actually hearing the stories where communities are open to it and they're wanting to grow. So I think this is a really good reminder that is there. And that folks should kind of get on the bandwagon. I'm doing two things here. I'm trying to listen to what you're saying and make sure that my questions are cohesive. So, John, I actually have one more question for you on this note. Have you seen the use of community septic systems in Connecticut, and have you seen these done well?
Yes, absolutely. I would point to the town of Essex, which doesn't necessarily have the greatest reputation in terms of embracing affordable housing. There's still, I was at a public hearing last night where there's a lot of NIMBYs in Essex, but Essex over the last 6 or 7 years actually did 3 separate affordable housing developments without sewer lines. Essex does not have sewer lines. They do have some public water, which is very helpful, but was able to find sites where you had decent soils and developed at the scale that was suitable to on-site wastewater treatment. In Essex, there's a 3-acre site that was actually 3 separate parcels. So they were able to do 3 separate community systems of 7,500 gallons a day or less, and did not trigger DEP review. So you actually had 3 separate apartment buildings, a total of 52 units, 16 of them are affordable, on, technically 3 buildings on 3 parcels. So they were each treated separately by the Department of Public Health. But and there's all kinds of cross easements happening and that sort of thing. They share parking lots and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's 3 community septic systems, 3 separate parcels, 52 units. And then there are two other projects in Essex that both were able to be done on private septic systems. So it can be done. You just have to have good engineers and you have to have decent soils.
So, to that point, Hugh, one point that you make in your Pipeline and Prosperity Guide is that homes that are built on septic in wealthier towns that are upward of 5,000 square feet, and they're housing multiple people in those homes. Are you sort of in that point, are you saying that the makeup of these homes and families would be comparable to a multifamily unit? uh, in a septic system would be able to support that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you look at especially in some of the wealthier parts of the state, you see a lot of knockdowns and rebuilds. They're on septic and they build really large houses. It's certainly allowed by the zoning code. But if you're talking about a multifamily development, you're not going to have something that's wildly out of character with many of the single family homes in that part of the state. And especially when you talk about changes in household size. Households are much smaller today than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. You're going to have fewer people on average in each household. And so you're not going to have a markedly greater strain on the system that already exists. So if you have a large single family home on a septic system, there's really no reason that you can't have a modest sized multifamily development on that same septic system. The capacity is there. I think there is a link in people's minds between single family homes and septic, but I think it's really important to get past that. There is a lot more that we can do on septic. It requires a different way of thinking, but it's not the capacity that's holding us back.
That's really great. We've got 10 more minutes, so I want to do a round robin kind of round for you all. For people who are interested in the issue of affordable housing and don't know where to start, from your perspective, Hugh, your policy perspective, John, your perspective, Rob, from your individual perspective of your sort of where you occupy the world, what would you suggest is the starting place?
I can just jump in. I would just say that so many zoning decisions, this really is a local process, right? This is something that so much is happening on the federal and state level that is out of our control. This is local. This is something that happens town by town. And you're often talking about a very small group of people who are making these decisions. You can have influence on a planning and zoning commission by just changing a couple of people's minds. And that's not always easy. A lot of people are entrenched. Some people have been in these positions for a long time. But if you can, you don't have to change a million people's minds. You have to change like 2 or 3 people's minds sometimes. So I'm not gonna minimize it and say that it's something you can do overnight, but it is something that is attainable. So I would just say, keep in mind that we can complain about local control in all sorts of ways, and I do plenty, but there are some benefits to it that you can make change faster sometimes, and if you can get your message out and educate people, you can make real change with only a small group of people.
That's great.
Yeah, I think that's true, and the numbers are really small. Like in Columbia, and most planning and zoning commissions, you've got 7 people, maybe 9. And so, your audience is maybe 4 people or 5 people. And in the case of Columbia, you had, 3 or 4 commissioners who just decided, what, we're losing people. We're losing our young families. We're losing, our school kids. It took 4 of them, to convince to change the zoning regulations. And I'm a planner, so I start with plans. Look at the plan of conservation and development, look at the affordable housing plan, and hold the town to it. Most towns will say, we want to encourage young families to grow here. We want to encourage, downsizers and retirees to have places to be, and places to retire. Hold them to it and sort of say, where is this going to be? What are the regulations that are standing in our way? And let's change those. Let's make it easier to be the kind of town that you say you want to be. And yeah, start with planning, start with the Planning and Zoning Commission, and understand the rules and understand the pressures that they're under.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Definitely, John. And from the other side of the perspective of from our organization that's looking to do this, my advice would be, don't let your lack of knowledge or expertise, or that it may just seem overwhelming, stop you from doing this. For our organization, we're four people, we're a 4-person board. None of us having a real extensive background in affordable housing, but a passion for this, a desire to see this change in the town. And like Hugh said, it's changing the minds of just a few people that are either on planning and zoning or in town government, or maybe there's that 2 or 3 vocal people that have been very opposed. Making those changes, you can turn those people very quickly from being enemies to advocates for what you're looking to do, and engaging that community right away. And the last word of advice would be, don't take no for an answer. We were told from the beginning, no, you can't do this in Hebron. The sewer doesn't work where you want to do this. There's no water in the town. The church isn't going to want to partner with you in that way. So, and all the roadblocks, we just kept moving forward. So you have to be comfortable hearing the word no, because that's what everyone's going to say in the beginning, it seems like. But if you have a plan, like John talked about the planning, Hugh talked about, engaging people and changing minds, and then continuing to just persevere and have that that perseverance, I think, there's the sky's the limit for what you can achieve. And it's been amazing to see what our small group of 4 people has been able to do and change in the town of Hebron in just a few short years.
Yeah, and I think, listen, I don't have a background in planning or sewage, and Hugh has been teaching me so much since I came on at OCA. And I really appreciate you all's advocacy and passion for this. It is such an important topic, and I think when folks are sort of advocating for this thing, sewers is not on their mind. And so as people try to figure out how to navigate this process, it's so critical to hear this and to understand what the roadblocks are to developing, affordable housing developments. And I thank you all for sharing your perspective with us tonight. I did want to open up for a couple of questions before we ended for the hour. So if you have a question, I welcome you to raise your hand, throw it in the chat, come off mute, and ask. John, Hugh, Rob, and even Aaron would be happy to answer questions. And actually, if we can get Aaron pinned, that would be great. There you go. Zenaida, I see your hand. You can unmute and ask.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, good evening. My name is Zenaida Gonzalez. I am a resident leader at PT Barnum. I've been living here for about 13 or 14 years. I am neighbors to the WPCA in Bridgeport and in Black Rock. And my concern with the new affordable housing, the multi-unit, if they don't go the septic route and they're going to be using our pipelines to the waste unit and the waste plant is not upgraded yet, wouldn't that cause more backup to the community that's next to the WPCA once the buildings are built and it's overflowing the pipes that have not been upgraded yet? That's my question.
I mean, I can just jump in there to say I don't know all the details of what's going on there. You're really right to be asking the question and digging into it. And if there are ways we can support you to help investigate, we'd be really happy to do that.
Thank you. I would really appreciate that.
Sounds like an engineering question, really, and ideally, getting into the world of backflow preventers and things like that, that's an engineering question. And we would happy to put you in touch with resources for that.
Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes. We did have one question in the chat for Hugh. Hugh, where did the 2-acre minimum for septic come from? Is it due to lack of knowledge originally or restrictive exclusionary zoning? I saw you gave the short answer, but I know you love to talk about this, so I'll give you an opportunity to give the long answer.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's about zoning. That there are a lot of factors that drive exclusionary zoning in Connecticut. There really is not a public health reason to have 2 acre zoning. You'll hear people argue otherwise, but in terms of what's possible, what you can do on the land, I mean, there's always exceptions. If you're in a swamp or you're on a side of a mountain or something, there's going to be exceptions. But in general, throughout Connecticut, you do not need 2 acres. It is really just about exclusionary zoning, which is a sad reality in Connecticut that we're working really hard to change.
Great.
And it's a fundamental conservativeness, right? And you if you get less than 2 acres, then you have to think about it a little bit more. You have to get creative with engineering. You have to, and so zoning it tends to be what's the simplest box we can draw that we're relatively confident that almost all properties can, develop a single family house. And, and that sort of crept up from 1 acre to 1.5 acres to 2 acres. And, conservatively, you can be relatively confident that you can get a house on 2 acres and not worry about separation distances and things like that and soils. But yeah, it's conservative, it's exclusionary, and it's lazy is what it is.
And if you start to analyze this and go back to sort of the history of segregation and start to look at racial covenants, and you start to look at when those were made illegal in the late 40s, when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the late 60s, you can see a trajectory where lots of towns around the country and around the state started to increase the minimum lot size. And so, in some cases, maybe it was just a matter of convenience, but in other cases, there was a real effort to kind of counteract these civil rights advances and have other ways of keeping out certain groups.
Great. Thank you for that. We've got one last question. Vince, I'll call on you. You can unmute and ask your question, and then we'll adjourn.
I don't necessarily have a question. I'll reinforce my biased opinion being on the zoning board. The members of the board will, take the 50 or 100 people that show up in opposition to something as the majority, and they'll cave to that. And I'm probably the only progressive on the board, and it feels like 80 against 1. So I think it's a simple place to start. I know our town has email alerts will tell you when the meetings are and send you the agendas, and show up and state your opinion that you are for these things, and it really helps the board do the right thing versus waiting till after the meeting and then asking Vince why they voted this down. It's like, well, because there was 50 people there in opposition to it. So my biased opinion.
Yeah, no, Vince, I think it's a great point. We underestimate the importance of organizing within our communities and talking to your neighbor and engaging your fellow resident in town, and mobilizing them to these meetings, right? It's one thing to show up to a meeting with one person, it's another thing to show up to a meeting with 50. And so, Vince, I think you bring up a good point, and I think this is a really good reminder for us that it can't just be us. It can't just be the people in the room here that we're looking at. We've got to mobilize the people in town who might be for this. Hugh, did you want to add something?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were unmuted. So it's 8:03. It's 3 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you all again so much for joining us tonight. Hugh, John, Rob, Aaron, thank you so much for your presentations, for offering your critical perspective on this very important issue. And for those on the call, you will receive a thank you message from us with access to both reports, which were released today. And you'll also receive the recording of the call if you just wanted to go back and reference the presentations for tonight. So again, thank you so much, and good night and take care.